Welcome to Let It Be. I'm Vanessa, and this is my little corner of music YouTube. So I'm going to do a should it stay or should it go today, but I'm going to do what I'm going to call a lightning round. So I'm going to look at 10 CDs fairly quickly. I just think they're titles that don't necessarily need a full video, but I do want to reassess them and see if I need to keep them. So if anyone hasn't seen this series, it's pretty basic concept. You just go through the items in your collection, some things that you might have doubts about, or stuff that you just don't listen to very often. And I always give them a fresh listen to see if I need to keep them or if I can declutter them. And I've had people ask me what I do or plan to do with them if I'm taking them out of my collection. So I will be taking them either to a record store to trade in for store credit, or I will be donating them to a thrift store, depending on what it is and how good I think my odds are getting any kind of anything for it. Yeah, so but I'm not throwing them out or anything like that. I'm just putting them back out into the world so someone else can enjoy them more than I do. So anyway, I'll get right into it. This is going to be no mercy, just going to go through quickly and talk about each one. So the first CD I have here is Elf by Alison Moyet. And I picked this up at some point at a thrift store. I don't really remember when or, you know, just one of those things you picked up on a whim. So I like Allison's work with Yaz or Yazoo, depending on where you are in the world, what you call them, quite a bit. I really like Upstairs at Eric's, but I can't say that that extends to this album. And it's not really her that's the issue here. I think that she gives some great performances vocally throughout this album. I'm just not a really big fan of a lot of these songs or the album as a whole. Invisible is pretty easily my favorite song here. Even the other singles are not songs that I am huge on, and the rest of the album just doesn't do a lot for me. It's just doesn't really resonate. And there's nothing else that I would even pinpoint as a highlight other than Invisible. So it's a shame because I've heard positive things about this album, and that's what really probably inspired me to pick it up in the first place. But it's just okay. I don't dislike it, but I would never reach for it ever again. And I'll stick with Upstairs at Eric's if I want to listen to Allison. So it's going to go. Next up, I have Voices Carry by Till Tuesday. So I absolutely love the song Voices Carry. So that's why I picked up the album. And I think that that song overshadows this album by quite a bit. But there are some other good moments. The first two songs, Love in a Vacuum and Looking Over My Shoulder, are good. And they were their best choice for follow up singles. And that's what they did, even though they didn't resonate nearly as much on the charts. They did make the right choice picking those songs. After that, the album droops a bit, and before and after Voices Carry. And the second half, there are a few other highlights. Like You Know the Rest is a good song. It does wear out its welcome a little bit, I will say, but it is a good song. Maybe Monday, Are You Serious? Those ones are pretty good. But the problem is that I don't feel the fire from Amy that I hear in the title track anywhere else in this album. She's so much more anonymous on the rest of this album. Even if there are a few good hooks here and there, it just doesn't totally capture that lightning in a bottle moment I think she has on that one song. But I have decided to keep this though. I do like it enough as an album that I'm going to keep it around. It's a 3.5, so it's not like one of my favorite albums, but it's good enough to keep. So that's going to stay. Next up is the Avett Brothers and the Magpie and the Dandelion. Now, I liked some of their previous albums, like Emotionalism and I and Loving You. So I picked this up when it came out. I hadn't been listening to them very much for a bit in between, but at that time I was buying a lot of CDs and just picking up albums, checking in with artists I knew I liked. But I remember being very disappointed, and I pretty well never thought about it again. I actually kind of forgot I even had it until I was looking through. And coming back, I just see why. It's just not really that interesting. It's pretty one note, song after song just runs together and it just kind of chugs along. And it feels really colorless despite having such a bright, vibrant color cover. Like you look at that cover, you think it's, I don't know, it's sort of supposed to evoke a sort of mood, but I don't think the album evokes that at all. It's very gray and brown, makes the cover feel like a lie. I don't know. And then they have this random live song near the end of the album. And I swore that I'd already heard it earlier in the album, but I hadn't. So that's not a good sign that their song sounds like other songs to the point where I actually think I've heard the song and I didn't. So it's all just kind of sonically jarring too, because it's not as loud as the rest of the album, which is quite loud. Like it's a very loud album for the type of music. And I don't know, just doesn't work. And Vanity after that is the one song that switches it up from the rest of the album, but it sucks. So the album is just kind of blah. And there's a reason I forgot I owned it and never went back to it. So it's going to go. It's also 2.5 for me. Next up, we have Babes in Toyland Nemesisters, which was their last album. I've had that one, this CD, for a really long time. I picked it up in high school. I had this phase where I was all like into what I considered Riot Girl, although I don't know that they fit into that, but that's a whole conversation for another day. Any female-based, loud, rocking stuff I was into. So I just grabbed everything I could find. There've always been a few songs on this album that I've listened to a lot, but I've never really listened to the full album regularly. And I revisited it before about a year ago, and I was actually quite disappointed by it. I thought it was pretty crappy, aside from the few songs that I always liked. And I wasn't really decluttering then, so I just kept it around. But so I gave it one more shot before deciding to get rid of it here. And yeah, at times, the album is rather drony in a way that becomes grating. The problem is that many of these songs never really feel like they go anywhere. They just kind of chug along and, it's like, what's the point? And I don't always like Kat Aland. I had to look up how to say that, and I'm still not probably saying it right. Her vocal delivery on these songs and whatever, especially whatever she's doing on SFW, is just awful. I don't know. It just doesn't work. And tack on some absolutely horrendous cover songs at the end, and it just becomes this dreadful chore of an album. All by myself, especially makes me not wonder why I was staying away from this album. And like, I think it's just horrible on purpose, maybe, but why? Like, why be horrible? I don't know. Like, it just doesn't need to be there. So even though there are a couple good songs here, it's still 2.5 stars and it's not enough to keep it. So it's going to go. Next, I have actually 2 albums by the same artist that I looked at separately, because why not? So by the beat or the English beat, depending on where you are, I just can't get enough in Special Beat Service. So I like Mirror in the Bathroom and I like Save It for Later a lot. So I've just picked these up at different times, finding them at the thrift store over the years. It's how I ended up with a lot of mass in my collection. I'd heard Better Special Beat Service when I did a deep dive of 1982, and I liked it, but I didn't love it. And I just didn't have much memory of I Just Can't Get Enough. So I thought, well, might as well reassess these. Listening to I Just Can't Get Enough now, I think a lot of it is quite different from Mirror in the Bathroom, which really stands out on the album. Although I think Big Shot is a pretty good song too. But I wouldn't say the majority of it is bad. It's just the only thing I wasn't into here was the cover of Tears of a Clown. But I don't see that myself putting this album on for any reason. Ska can be rather hit or meh for me. And this particular album is kind of leaning more to the latter. I just didn't find much of it stood out. So I'm going to give that one 3 stars. And Special Beat Service, they still have their ska roots on display. But there's more variation in the sound of the album overall. There's some more pop, there's some more new wave influences showing up. And I wouldn't say that I'm totally into every song on it, but I think there's enough here to like, and the highlights are really strong. And I tend to gravitate toward the songs that are more pop influence here. But I also like that they haven't abandoned their ska sound entirely. Like they've stayed true to their roots. So that's really cool. So on that note, I am going to get rid of I Just Can't Stop It, and I'm going to keep Special Beat Service. And next up is Ben Harper, Fight for Your Mind, another CD I've had for a really long time. He was really popular with my peers in my first year of university, and people played his songs a lot on guitar at like open mic nights and just different things that we were doing. I really loved Another Lonely Day at the time, so I picked up this album. And I don't remember really listening to the full album a lot, which is why I thought of it for this, because it's just always been sitting there. But I remembered a lot more of the songs on here than I thought that I did. So I must have listened to it more than I thought. There's some good stuff here, and some songs that just don't do as much for me. I find the album just kind of bogs itself down a lot in the last quarter. I could do without the almost 12-minute God-Fearing Man, for instance, and some other songs I find a bit repetitive. And so I don't think this is a bad album, and there are some decent songs here. It's just nothing that I'm going to reach for any more now than I have for the last 20 years already. It's just been sitting there collecting dust. So it's decent, and I flip-flopped a little bit on it, but I just don't need it. I've proven to myself that I'm not going to listen to it. So it's 3 stars, pretty strong 3 stars. I love Another Lonely Day still. Great song. Rest of it though, yeah. So it's gonna go. Next, I don't know if I'll ruffle feathers with this one, not sure. But we have Journeyman by Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton's an interesting case of someone whose public reception or just reception among musical communities has changed so much in my lifetime. It's crazy where he went from being unquestionably God when I was growing up, and now people really, really push back against him. So it's interesting. But anyway, regardless of all that, looking at this album as an album, I actually got this one from my dad because he picked it up at the thrift store and he didn't really care for it. So he passed it along to me, and I've just kind of held on to it and never really thought of give it a second thought. I'm not even sure if I ever really ended up listening to it at the time. So it's perfect candidate to revisit for this. The 80s production tends to be pretty distraction on the first or on this one, especially on the first few songs. There are times that it feels super at odds with his guitar playing. Like it's clearly intended that his guitar playing is the primary focus on a lot of these songs, but like it's clashing with the rest of the song, and it just almost feels like they just clumped it in there with everything else, and it's jarring. I don't know. And then all of a sudden, the production gets dialed back, and they have this like stretch of like more rootsy kind of bluesy songs, and that is better. Like it's better than the super 80s stuff, but and it's still got some sheen to it. It's not like super stripped back or anything. Like I'm not trying to say that, but it does let his guitar playing become a focus that fits more into the rest of the music, at least. And then it goes back to being super 80s again after that little block, almost like just like a little, I don't know, intermission. And then suddenly we're back. And this album bounces around stylistically quite a bit, and it keeps it interesting because it is a pretty long album, but I don't think it always works, and I definitely don't always care about it. The more 80s sounding songs tend to be completely at odds with him, like I said, and it just feels off. I definitely prefer the unplugged versions of a couple of the songs, like Old Love and Before You Accuse Me. And I found that on this album, at least, Before You Accuse Me had some like ridiculously loud drums that were just totally distracting. So anyway, 2.5 stars for this one. Don't ever need to hear it again. I don't think anything on this really served him that well. So that's going to go. Jewel Spirit is our next album. Yeah, so I have had this album since it came out, and I never liked it. So I have no idea why. I'm still holding on to it, but it's just one of those things, you know. So I really liked her first album when it came out at the time. I mean, I was like 11 years old. So it's just one of those things that resonated with me. I'm not sure how well it would age. I haven't revisited that one yet, but I was going to go through this one first since I knew I didn't like it. Because at the time, I remember being quite excited for her to release another album. I went out and got it, and it was such a letdown. And yeah, it's and it's still, spoiler alert, not very good. I remember just immediately being disappointed. And one thing that really stands out now in general, Jewel, is just how terrible and goofy her lyrics tend to be. Like, even on the first album, when I think back, there is some pretty dumb stuff on there. But I guess that can be charming with some people, but it doesn't come across that way with her. It comes across very try hard when she does it, and it just does not work. She always feels like she thinks she's saying something very profound, which she's really not at all. And it's so distracting. And I'm not necessarily this huge stickler about lyrics. A lot of the time, like if I love music and the lyrics are kind of mid, that doesn't detract for me. But if the songs are not going to support anything and the lyrics are actively bad, then the lyrics are going to make a difference. And they absolutely do here. The music is just so blah and colorless, much like the Yvette Brothers album in a different way, but still very gray, like its cover. And it's so self serious. It's just so tedious to listen to. And it didn't work for me when I was 13 and I first bought this album, and I had way more patience for this kind of crap. And it definitely does not work for me now. So this is the worst of all of these albums. It's 2 stars. It is absolutely going to go, and I never want to think about it ever again. So anyway, our last album is by Mary Chapin Carpenter, and it's called Stones in the Road. I went through a really big country period a few years ago, around 2017, and I bought a ton of CDs at the time at the thrift store, but I never really spent a lot of time actually listening to the albums. Country albums, especially, are pretty easy to pick up. They're around, they're dime a dozen, especially from the 90s and the 80s and stuff. So I had a ton, and I've already decluttered a bunch without really going through a major assessment period, because a lot of them, they're just not necessary to own. A lot of these people are better off served by a greatest hits compilation or a few songs. But anyway, I listened to this one recently for my 1994 deep dive that I already made a video about a little while ago. And I was pretty underwhelmed by it, which was a little disappointing because I always considered myself, maybe like not necessarily a huge fan of Mary Chapin Carpenter, but I know that I have I have actually a few of her albums, and I remember liking them better than I liked this one. And coming back to it again, just to make sure that I'm ready to get rid of it. My opinion stands. It's nice, it's pleasant, it's easy to listen to, but there's absolutely nothing on this album that really grips me. I've listened to it now twice in the last couple months, and I cannot even think of a song off the top of my head that's on it. So that's not good. Maybe when you're listening to it, a song or two stands out, but I am so neutral even on them. It's just like, oh yes, this kind of stands out. It's better than not standing out. But when you're at that point, it's not really worth it. So there's just really not much to say about it other than that it's nice and pleasant, and I just don't care about it at all. So 3 stars, gotta go. So in the end, there were 10 CDs. I kept 2. I'm getting rid of 8. So that's a pretty successful, or I don't know, how do you define success here? I guess success is decluttering things you don't want, and I have done that, so that is good. But yeah, are you familiar with any of these albums? Do you think I'm crazy for getting rid of some of these, or do you agree? I always love to hear even completely opposing opinions in the comments, so just let me know. Right? Bye.